You like that, Morgan?
I
The 7
did.
seconds of non-silence of my off-key voice.
Good morning, everyone. Hello. Happy Tuesday. I'm excited for this one.
Yeah, you see us on a Tuesday, you see us on a Wednesday, you know that we're bringing a guest.
Mm-hmm.
And Morgan, who is our
Yes.
guest today?
Well, I got it. Here's the thing. David is our guest today, but the real thing is that David is one of probably the super influential sales coaches, sales leaders in so many of our personal networks, and maybe those of you who are joining us here today. So he's an author. He's the founder and CEO at Cerebral Selling, or chief sales scientist as well. And welcome to the stage, David Priemer.
And I have to say, just before we bring David on,
Oh, God.
also
Okay.
one of the most dynamic speakers you're ever going to see. And he's also made me question my setup more than a couple of times.
Mm-hmm.
You ready? Ready
Yep.
for David?
Hey, here we are. Welcome. As I was sitting there and I preempted it for all of you listeners out there, I said, my daughter comes home from camp and she brings home this like non-COVID virus and, infects the whole house. So I'm still recovering. So this is not necessarily how I normally sound, but I said, I'm going to try to turn up as much as I can for you. But I was wondering, when you have other guests on the show, does Morgan say something like, yeah, so we got Nick on the show. I don't know. I think he's okay. I'm not super excited. Like on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm like a 5. But let's bring him on, Nick. You ever do that?
No, we're always excited for our guests, David.
That's just when Morgan skips the intro and brings them on. No, just kidding.
Yeah, it's only when I don't do any intro at all. We just
Who do we
just
got?
launch
We got
right
them.
Into it. Yeah,
all
I
right.
know.
Well, whatever. You win
all right,
some,
so
you lose some.
What we like to start around here with is just a question of the day. So hello to everyone joining us. If you're here, drop a hi in chat, and then we'd love to hear your answer to this question. But it's just a fun one, David. One thing that this might be somewhat of an ironic question, given that you are an author of your own book. But I wanted to know, what's the sales book that changed the way you sell?
I feel like I want to say 2 books. But I'll go back to the OG. The first one was called 50 Scientifically Proven Ways to Be Persuasive. And I picked this up by Robert Cialdini, as many people know, and a bunch of other authors. And I picked this up at my 3rd startup because one of our investors was very big into learning and reading, and he bought like a stack of these books for us. And it was the first book that I read. Now I'm trying to date this book. Like it could be 2011, 2010, like in that time frame. And it was the first book that I read that had kind of put science on the same plane as selling. And I'm a sucker for the science of everyday stuff. There's a lot we can learn just by observing the world around us. So it was the first book that did that for me. So I really loved it. And it actually became a required reading for my teams. Like I would buy stacks of them and give them to my team. So that was, I'd say, the first book that did it for me.
That's awesome.
Good choice. His book Persuasion is also another must.
100%.
How about you, Nick? What was a book that you had?
For going back to the OG, the one that really made a huge impact and kind of got me started investing myself was How to Make Friends and Influence People, Dale Carnegie. It made me realize that investing in yourself is a powerful investment, but only when you put it into practice. And so when you read, don't just read to finish the book, actually apply it, and it's a game changer. But I always joke, like back in the day, we didn't have Kindle. So it was us either bought the book or you were sitting in the library. And back in those days, it was me sitting in the library. Same with doing our account research.
The full yellow pages. Me? It's interesting because as everyone knows, I'm not a seller by trade. I think so. I sort of learned through error. Especially as a self-employed. I think the first book that really consolidated everything was Pricing Creativity by Blair Enns. It's just the formula workbook for consultative selling, in my opinion. There's all the consultative selling literature and books, but then there's Blair's, which is here's why it works and here's how to do it. and it really just was transformative and something I still use today. Just the principles of the psychology and anchoring, and I'm sure plenty of other stuff we might get into today with you, David.
He's also Canadian, so I'm just gonna throw
Oh,
that in there. So
the fellow
Although
Canadian.
it's ironic that as an author, when you write a book, the directives are you got to pander to Americans. So like all the spelling is American spelling. There's no OUs in different places and so on. But I will say that when I read the audiobook, which sounds a lot better than I do now for my book, I went full Canadian pronunciation, process, project, the whole bit. Yeah. So
I
enjoy.
love
There you
that.
go.
are you
I
wearing
love
Very-
that.
you have your like flag wrapped around you too? And
I,
Yeah. I like
yeah.
Nirjan's comment. Let's go Canada. Indeed. I'll be the lonely American on today's call. Which, by the way, shall we just dive in? Shall we just get into it?
yeah, it's an important topic. Let's get in there.
I The headlines recently have definitely been a little topsy turvy, and that was sort of I think the inciting incident for this conversation, David, because what we hear a lot from sellers is, well, the world's the world's on fire is maybe too far, but there's so much change happening, and companies are laying people off, and the economy is sort of upside down in some ways, and maybe selling is harder than it used to be. So, in just this moment, because of all of this circumstance. So, maybe to kick it off, what do you see are the maybe the fundamentals that we lose sight of in moments where the world goes crazy, where we feel like we're in survival mode? Like, what are the things we just suddenly start ignoring when we shouldn't ignore?
Yeah. Well, there's this concept I talk a lot about. So, being like a research scientist by education, I talk a lot about this concept of inertia, right? This is like Newton's third law: the object in motion tends to stay in motion, and so on. And inertia is what propels so many of the challenges that we as sellers experience in the market. And one of the best examples, certainly during, I'm going to use the phrase during times like these a whole bunch of times, but like in times like these, sometimes if you don't know how you're supposed to react or behave or change your motion, you just go and you just do what you were doing before, right? And this is actually not just in times like these. I see this a lot, especially with, for example, young sales leaders. And we can talk about leadership because there's a whole leadership
Mhm.
angle to this conversation as well. But let's say, for example, I am a seller and I did really well in my job. I get promoted to manage the team. I don't really necessarily have a leadership playbook yet. I have an individual contributor playbook, and I'm just going to continue to run that and kind of impose that on my team until I figure out what I should be doing differently. So this idea of inertia, and then that certainly in times of adversity, as we find ourselves in, that can lead us astray. So this idea of inertia is something we're always trying to combat. It's exactly kind of what Nicholas was saying at the beginning. That what's sometimes referred to as the knowing doing gap, which is actually a book by two Stanford professors, Bob Sutton, Jeff Pfeffer. And they said, why is it? And you could apply this to so many things. Why is it that there's so many books? They were specifically applying it to management and leadership. So many books on management and leadership exist, so much knowledge, and yet people suck. Why are there so many books on, and I talk about this in my book, why are there so many books on diet and weight loss and exercise, and yet proportion of obese people keeps going up, right? It's not lack of knowledge, it's lack of implementation of the knowledge. And the question is like, why are we not implementing this newfound knowledge? It's sometimes we don't know the tactics, as kind of Nick was saying at the beginning, and sometimes we don't appreciate why we should change. Whenever you ask someone to change, the thing they're thinking about in their head is like, why should I do this? So inertia is the enemy of so many sellers, of so many leaders, of so many sales operations, and that's how we get in trouble. We just don't know what to do, so we just keep doing what we were doing before.
Hmm.
Hmm. So
Can,
do you think like how we're prospecting actually magnifies this too? Because a lot of sellers, they lead with themselves, the I'm amazing pitch, and they're not really focusing on like the why change, why now. Because it almost, from what I hear, that inertia is really that survival mechanism. And you're like, I know this works, so you guys need to do what I did because what I did made me me. So if you guys double down on what made me successful, you guys will be successful too. And I think that's part of that inertia, right? Is that survival mechanism.
Well, you're stepping right into it, man. This is what I refer to in my book. Chapter 1 is called the Cobra Kai paradox. You know what I mean when I say Cobra Kai?
No.
Yeah, I do.
Morgan knows. What's
Yeah,
Cobra Kai, Morgan?
it's from Karate Kid, right?
That's right. It's a
Hmm.
it's a Karate Kid reference. For those of you who remember, so I'm, not to age myself, I'm 47 years old. So when I was 9, the movie The Karate Kid comes out. And now The Karate Kid, like, it's out, there's like a new version of it and so on. And so it's this pop culture reference to the Cobra Kai, which is kind of like the opposite end of the Mr. Miyagi spectrum. It's this karate studio where they teach, no mercy. It's all about winning and the competition. And they build these jerks, like these bully I don't want to swear on your show, like these bully
You're more
jerk.
than welcome
Let
to.
it- let
Don't
her
worry.
rip.
Let her
So,
rip.
so they build these like asshole, if I can say, like asshole kids, right? Who are actually the thing that I talk about in the very first chapter is like, these are not bad kids. Bad salespeople, of which there are many, are not bad people. Okay. They're good people. They have friends, family, people that love them. They're just like us, okay? But they chose to learn from the wrong sensei. I went to the Cobra Kai and I learned how to be an asshole. And by the way, like, now in the case of the Cobra Kai, you could argue that they were poorly intentioned in their approach. However, back to what Nicholas is saying is like, the way I learn sales, we don't go to sales school. Like, there, and I talk about this. There's so few, schools, business programs, especially in the US, that teach anything having to do with sales. And yet it's so important and fundamental to what we do in every element of business. But there's no governing body. There's no license. There, like, anyone could be in sales. And so what happens is we choose our sensei. And if we choose to learn from someone who's just, well, this is what I did, here's what you should do, that's where we get into problems. So if you're not always learning and questioning, you are just going to be dragged along by inertia and then be sitting there wondering, why is the stuff that I was doing 2 years ago, why is that not working anymore? And in the sciences, that might kind of be okay-ish. I mean, science moves fast, as we've seen in the last few years. However, foundational principles, math, physics, like, they've remained unchanged for like the foundational key stuff for a long period of time. But sales has changed so much, partially because buying has changed so much. So if you're learning from a sensei who learned their craft, who were well-intentioned, not an asshole, but well-intentioned, and you're learning the tactics, that worked a number of years ago, and it's not going to work anymore. And it's funny, to give you an example. Can I give you an example?
Absolutely.
Of course.
I'm just gonna, like, because I believe sales is life, and we can learn lots of stuff from life. So if you remember at the beginning of the pandemic, when advertisers were, they're still running the ads. So the pandemic hit, it was like really fast. And advertisers were still running the ads that they had, because it takes time to create ad campaigns and so on. They're running ads and copy and all that kind of stuff from before the pandemic. And then, what happened was they eventually changed to like the soft piano music. We're all in this together, right? But then that only lasted like a certain period of time, to the point where people are like, okay, now we're in it and the message needs to change. And so what happened was a lot of these advertisers were kind of caught flat-footed, where they were not agile enough with their messaging, because the way society was kind of absorbing the state of the moment was moving a lot faster than they were. And so I say the same thing with selling. The algorithms, like, I know 1,000% the stuff that I used to post to LinkedIn, for example, 2 years ago, doesn't work the same way it works now. LinkedIn, in a way, this is not a commentary on social media, is becoming more like Facebook. It's more of like the emotional posts, not sharing articles, not sharing videos, pictures of our families, our personal struggles, that kind of stuff. And so if you're not seeing that and adapting, and you're still running the same stuff you did 2 years ago, you're going to fail. And it's that inertia that pulls us along.
Choose your sensei is probably one of the most beautiful, powerful example, or because it's like you're buying into a franchise, and basically what resources are you getting, because you're your own independent person doing the work. So what do you get in return to do the best job you can? Well, choose your sensei. Like, people leave managers, they don't leave companies. How brilliant is that in the sales world? My
Mhm.
goodness. And that was a wicked opening chapter.
What what when when we're thinking about ownership, this is interesting because I think Nick and I have seen this a lot in companies that we've been talking to and working with, is that the world sort of changes, whether buyer behavior changes. Maybe you have a company that said they had budget and then now they don't have budget. And now we continue along with the same supposed path as before. How can we, like, what are the ways that we can overcome this inertia? Like, you, David, what do you do? Is it just like a gut check, like, oh, okay, things have changed, I need to adapt? Or like, how can organizations or sales teams be agile in moments like this where things are a little topsy-turvy?
Yeah. Well, look, I think there's kind of two ways. Number one, you just look at the data.
Hmm.
The data will tell you if your conversion rates are getting better, getting worse. As you expand to different markets or different, segments of, customer types. So we're working with bigger customers, smaller customers. The data will tell you whether or not you're kind of, leading in the right direction. But the other piece is just, the prevailing sentiment of society. I was having this conversation with a senior sales leader today, and they were asking me, David, like, what do you see in the market in terms of like the slowdown, like what's actually happening? And I saw this as well at the beginning of the pandemic, which is some of the slowdown is warranted. Like, for example, if you sold to hospitality or airlines at the beginning of the pandemic, you should you don't need the data to tell you like you should switch. Like, the society is telling you that ain't where the money's at,
Uh-huh.
nowadays. However, but what also happened at the pandemic at the beginning was that there was a lot of fear, like fear motivated change. And you had, for example, a bunch of venture funded technology companies that said, hey, you know what? We're not selling to airlines or, hospitality. We're kind of good, but shoot, like we're going to look to raise a bunch of money in the next year or so. And I don't know what the funding climate's going to be like. So I think we need to hold on to the cash we have and be a bit more conservative with it. So we're going to let some people go, and we're going to, stop these projects, not because anything was fundamentally wrong with their business, but because it was just the fear. And I'm actually seeing that happen again now, where you have certainly some businesses are having a tough time because maybe what they sell is, if I were to refer to it as discretionary, although, this idea of like nice to have. I actually my belief is like everything is a nice to have. Like no one needs anything. Like you need actually very little. And especially in the technology world where we operate, like no one really needs technology. Like they can get by with whatever they're doing, right? So no one really needs anything. But, depending on, for example, who you're selling to, if you're selling to, for example, a sales or marketing leader, it's very different in times like these than selling to like an HR leader. And I sold to HR leaders for many years of my career. It's just a different kind of experience, and certain things get cut first more than others. But a lot of it is still fear. It's this question of like, okay, what's going to happen in times of uncertainty? People just tend to like recoil and cocoon, and they kind of live to fight another day. And then we were kind of talking about this a little bit, I think earlier. In a way, sometimes this can work to your advantage, because I remember my startup, one of my startups in 2008, we started this company. We eventually ended up getting acquired by Salesforce in 2012. And I don't need to tell you what happened. 2008 was not a good time, for the
No.
world. But in a way, it was kind of good for us because we could almost work to build our product in secrecy, without a lot of fanfare, without a lot of pressure, and kind of emerge with the product once the economy had recovered. So, if you look at the fundamentals, yes, like there are certain problems with the economy and things happening now, but like unemployment is like record low. So it's not like, people don't have jobs. It's not like they're not working places. The markets are kind of coming back. The supply chains are kind of coming back. So other than inflation, which is a lot of things that are driving it, just a lot of, I think what's driving a lot of what you're seeing today, it's just a lot of fear, a lot of fear, uncertainty. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't adjust your sales motion, but those two things, you're reconciling the data with the prevailing sentiment, and that will give you kind of your signal to move forward in a different way.
Hmm.
It's interesting reflecting on that, and like it's all pain and gain when you're going and picking, like you want to be a priority number 1 or 2, or you may not exist in this quarter. But we're thinking of like the pain of change versus the status quo. The perceived pain is higher to change because they want to keep that capital for just in case. They're living in that fear. So That's a huge reframe that you're going to have to do, even to open up that conversation, which we talk about setting the tone with our prospecting. Whew, that's a tough place to be.
Fighting
Well,
against the status quo. Yeah.
I'll tell you, what you said is really important, like setting that reframe and showing them that the way forward with you is actually better than what they're doing today. And this was a session I did on my in my Facebook group. So I do these live sessions almost every week, and I had this session that I did where I said, salespeople need to focus on people. Salespeople conflate the two concepts of importance and priority all the time. And what I mean by that is, like, let's say, for example, I were to say, gentlemen, is your, what are the most important things for you in life, right? You might say, like, my health, my family, like those. If I didn't have those things, then I have nothing, right? And we would all probably agree that that's the case. But then if I followed you around every day and I wrote down everything you ate and how often you exercised and how much time you spent with your family, would it be consistent with what you said was important? So importance speaks to the relative magnitude of the problem that the customer is looking to solve. You agree that health and family are the most important in terms of problems, if I can say, to solve. It doesn't mean that's where you're spending the most time. And so it's funny, I speak to sellers all the time who put together these amazing business cases for customers, and they all these assumptions, they validate them, and the customers still don't move forward, right? Why is that? It wasn't that what you said wasn't important. It's just that the customer didn't recognize that what you had to say was the first, second, or third most, relevant thing that they needed to focus on that moment. Now, sometimes we can, as sellers, kind of escalate the priority of our initiative by trying to staple it to something they're already working on, right? And so we actually did that when we got acquired by Salesforce. Salesforce sold a product that was like this, right? And we sold a product that was like that. So we were like this little ankle biter. We're like, oh, please attach us to this deal. Please attach us to that deal, And the sales reps are like, well, like you're so little. I don't know why. I don't want to sell them a whole new thing and explain to them why they need this little thing. So what do? We align our messaging to say, no. The reason why you're investing in this little thing is the same reason why you invested in this big thing, right? And so the attach rate became a lot higher. And so the same thing happens in your business. And I saw this at lots of companies, never mind in an economic downturn. A lot of times the things that we're selling to our customers are not necessarily the most important or highest priority thing. They have other priorities. However, if we can somehow align the thing that we're selling with one of those higher priorities and kind of staple it to the high priority, right, then it makes the case much more impactful internally. Now, the one other thing I'll just kind of add to this is that sometimes, let's say, for example, you're in let's say we're in a tough economic time now, and your solution can actually save the customer a bunch of money and time, or they should actually do it. But they're operating on inertia, and they're thinking that, like, they basically, whatever you say, they discount by 90%. And so you can never kind of raise above the fold. One of the things that you can do, and this is, this is going to sound, this is a thing I talk about in my book and my content. It's going to sound weird, but hear me out. Is I say sometimes when you, how's that for like a preemptive, now I gotta, like, it's gotta live up.
I like it.
So yeah, petting zoos. That's what you need. No, not petting zoos. So I say sometimes when you want to sell someone a Band-Aid, you have to cut them first. Now, I'm not suggesting that anyone go out there and intentionally harm anyone. What I am saying is that customers walk around with problems that they do not realize the magnitude of, even in their own organizations. And so I say sometimes when you're trying to relate what it is you do to a problem they can solve, they're immediately going to discount you and say, like, oh, like, for example, I'm selling IT security software. And I go to Morgan and I say, hey, Morgan, we can help you and improve your security and do A, B, and C. And Morgan says, no, I'm good. Like, we have this software in place and it's working. And I'm thinking to myself, Morgan doesn't even realize how exposed his organization is. He doesn't know what the latest viruses or the latest, the cyber threats are. And so in order for him to become receptive to my message, I need to cut him. Like, I need to scare him a little bit. right? In the best possible Mr. Miyagi way, and show him that no, like the world in the future is a lot different than the way you see it, or the way the world is now is a lot different than the way you see it. And here's why this should be a higher priority. It's like if you said, I'm healthy enough, like I don't need to exercise. Health is important, but at a certain point I'm healthy. I'm not trying to run a triathlon here. And I might say, well, look, Morgan, when I typically see people in your position, 80%, you know, within the next 10 years end up having a heart attack, right? And now all of a sudden you're like, oh, shoot, I thought everything was good, but now I realize maybe this should be a higher priority. And you see this all the time when people have scares or issues, all of a sudden, they completely reshift their focus in life because all of a sudden something became a higher priority. So as sellers, we can do that as well.
Well, it makes sense. Problem with pain. If the pain isn't evident, you're not going to fix it. And the pain fades as you make it status quo. You're like, what do you mean? Everybody struggles with putting data into the CRM. No, I don't want to go and pick up the phone because nobody picks up the phone anymore. So we just go and do this instead. You start justifying it until it's too hard or too big to ignore. Like I heard somebody talking about going to the doctor, and they had been chasing them for 5 or 10 years to clean up their diet because they had really high blood pressure and something else and diabetes, and it just wasn't a thing. And the doctor said, we're at a point where I'm worried I'll never see you again unless you make a change, and I'm really surprised you haven't had a heart attack or something to now. So
It's that same, yeah. It's like a frame. It's like what does Challenger call it? It's a frame breaking insight, something like that, that reframes the way people think.
100%. And look, I also say, like, in times like these, you have to pick and choose who you use those tactics with, right? So, for example, let's say we're at the beginning of the pandemic and airlines and restaurants, hospitality are going down, right? The question is, do I want to, even armed with the best cutting tactics, do I want to go and try to service those customers now? Like, in all fairness, like, they're not buying anything. And on a scale of 1 to 10, I would have to come over the top with some crazy transformative thing for them to kind of say yes, right? Versus, in a regular time or in times like these, let's say you have an organization that's kind of clamping down on spending just because of fear and anxiety about raising money, whatever, and you could actually help them. Maybe that's a better use of your time and energy. I kind of always think of customers as existing on like a spectrum. I know I've done 2 different spectrums like this, like on a scale of 1 to 10, if a customer needs to be an 8 before they buy something from you, the question is, where are they now? If they're a 2 or a 3, then I need to do a lot of work to sell them up to an 8 before they buy something. And like, that's a lot of work. I don't want to do that work. Like I'll put in all the work to get them up to a 6 and they still won't buy anything. But if I can find like the 5s and 6s and put in the work to sell them up to an 8, that's a good use of my time. So my advice to all of you trying to figure out, okay, who should I pursue? How should I change up my motion? Try to figure out for your space in your kind of ideal customer profile, who are the 5s and 6s? Going for the 2s and 3s now, not only will require you to spend a whole bunch of time and effort that you don't have and result in nothing, but in a way, it can sound a little tone deaf to your customers. And one of the things that I talk about, I have this article talk about tips for connecting with customers, especially during times of adversity. And one of the things that I talk about is this biochemical reaction that people have during times of adversity. And I've talked about this a lot, this idea that if you think back to some of the most memorable days, let's say of your professional career, your personal life, the things that you tend to remember most are obviously like the bigger events, but oftentimes the times where things went wrong for you.
Yep.
Like I remember, I talk about this in my book. I was diagnosed with cancer a number of years ago. I remember exactly what I was wearing, the car I was driving, what the weather was like that day. And the reason is because when you find yourself in a tough situation, it's evolution's way of helping you figure out in the future, should you find yourself in that situation again, how to get out of it. So like you're trapped in like the bear pit, all of a sudden the biochemical markers in your brain hit record. And so it's playing back, and it can play back years from now, the sequence of events that you took to get out of that bad situation. And that's why it does that, to help you get out of bad situations in the future. But what also happens, kind of like the corollary of this, is that if you treat your customers poorly and you sound tone deaf when they're actually going through a period of hardship, and you're trying to sell to them and put the hard pressure on them, they will have long memories of that as well. And when the smoke finally does clear, which it will, they will have negative memories of you and your company. The experience that your customer has with your company is the product. The experience is the product. And so if they have a bad experience with you, of course, that will hurt your sales now and in the future. If they have a bad experience with you while they are down in the dumps in a tough time, they will never do business with you again, because they'll remember. So it's really important to be mindful of how we treat people, the twos and threes, in times like these. Unintentional rhyme, sorry.
Never cut them while they're down.
Yeah. Yeah.
Every time you say that, it just gives me a chuckle. But it makes sense. It even makes sense with like bad outreach when I can't remember the Cobra Kai. And so like you kick somebody and then they're down and you keep going. I think that's why some salespeople get a bad rep, because that sticks.
Yeah. Like the relentless follow-up when you really haven't added value, you've just been annoying the whole
Yeah,
time.
Nick calls it the multi-generational sequence, where they won't just go after you, but they'll go after your kids as well. They're just going to keep on pursuing you relentlessly across generations.
I
Yeah.
love it. Yeah. Which, by the way, sometimes what sellers do, and I don't mean to single out, but especially young sellers, and I say young sellers because young sellers don't talk to people on the phone as much, like in their personal lives. Like it's kind of funny. All of the phone numbers that I know in my head were memorized like prior to 2005. Like my parents' phone number, I can remember. My phone number, I can. Like, but my kids' phone numbers, if you tortured me to death, I could not tell you what their phone numbers are, because the part of my brain that is responsible for memorizing phone numbers is a part that I don't need anymore. There's things that do that. And so it's kind of the same thing, when let's say I'm a seller or a young person, and I don't talk on the phone in my personal life, because who talks on the phone? It's like Facebook is for old people, right? Like, I'm on Snapchats and the Insta whatever's, I'm on the TikToks and all that kind of stuff. And so what happens is we say to ourselves, well, I'm trying to prospect into Nick here, but you know what? My boss is telling me to make all these calls and follow up and follow up. But you know what I hate? I hate it when people call me. This is actually when I was at a conference in 2016 in New York City that Salesforce was organizing, and Gary Vaynerchuk is speaking. He gets up on stage. I'll never forget this. And he says, it was just, who here hates it when this is exactly what he said. Who here hates it when another human being calls them on the phone? That was it. There was no qualification. Is it your mother? Is it your friend? Like, who hates it? And 40% of the audience, sales and marketing leaders, put their hands up, 1,000 people. And he says, you know why they do that? Why you say that is because the most precious thing in this economy and how busy we are, the most precious thing you have is your time. And when someone calls you on the phone, it's like they're stealing your time. It's like, you will talk to me now. I've chosen this moment in time for you to talk to me. And that's why they hate it. So you compound that with young people or people who don't talk on the phone, and you tell them make 50 calls a day. And they have this internal conflict where they say, well, shoot, I don't like to be bothered. So you know what? I'm not going to bother Nick. I'm not going to bother Morgan. And even though my boss in the sequence is telling me to follow up 13 times, I'm not going to do that, because I don't like it when people do that to me. Right.
I also wonder, David, if part of it, Gary Vee is just, that's a hook, line, and sinker. But one thing I wonder is that part of the reason is that the seller doesn't know why they're calling in the first place. Somebody just hands them a list. Why are they on the list? Why am I calling them now? I think that's part of the problem, even, and it's more important now than ever, is having context to call. Because you can burn a bridge, like you were saying, very quickly by calling someone when it's not the right time, or even just opening up with the wrong message, because you should be just calling all sales managers, but you're calling sales managers in different industries, and it's just something different that resonates with them. Different, they feel the pain differently, it shows up differently in their life, and so they've to go and put it into their day to day, it just doesn't resonate because that's not how they talk.
Well, this gets, I'm so glad you brought this up, because this gets into a whole other, which we won't get into the whole thing, but a whole other area, which is, a concept that I refer to in my book and my content. I call it experience asymmetry. So actually I wrote an article in Harvard Business a few years ago. It was called How Younger Salespeople Can Sell to Older Customers. And I talked about this concept of experience asymmetry. And what experience asymmetry is the fear and trepidation that's manifested by a seller when they're trying to call on a more senior, experienced buyer whose job they've never done. And the simple example is, as I say, like my kids. Okay, so I have three daughters. Two are teenagers. One's 10. When they come to me and they're about to hit me up for something that they think I'm going to say no to, right? I can tell immediately just by the way they approach me, right? It's like dad, like the answer is no. I immediately feel defensive. And what was interesting, do you know what I'm talking about? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Like, and because kids can't hide it. But what I found was the same thing at Salesforce. And shout out, when I was at Salesforce, I used to run small business sales for the Eastern US. So I would have teams in a bunch of different cities, and my New York City sales reps always hustled the most. But sometimes I would have these reps that would have lots of activity, no pipeline. So I would start listening to their calls, because I'm like, I have no other recourse to figure out what's going on with you. So I'm listening to Morgan's calls, and I'm closing my eyes, and I don't even care about the words. I'm just like listening for whatever. And what I would do is I would go back to Morgan and I would say, Morgan, it sounds to me like you're bothering this customer. Like, that's what it sounds like. It sounds like you're reading a script that you don't believe in, and you've never done this person's job. And you're thinking in the back of your head, who the hell am I? Why would this VP of whatever pay attention to me? I'm just a kid, right? And it's manifesting in your tone of voice, right? It's like when you get a call from a telemarketer. How long does it take you to tell that it's a telemarketer reading from a script?
Immediately. Yeah.
Yeah, like
Uh-huh.
instantaneously, just by the way they approach you. And so I say the same thing. Like, if you're a seller of any, and I used to think that experience asymmetry was young selling to old, euphemistically. But what I realized is also new selling to experience. So you could have 20 years of sales experience calling on a buyer whose job you've never done, or you're new to your company. They armed you with the pitch, say this. And oftentimes the things they ask you to say are not words that human beings say to each other. And so what happens is, yeah, God bless product marketing. I say,
Yeah.
I'm doing a full Ricky Bobby, with all due respect to product marketing. The things that they put out, but the things that appear on your website, most cases are not things that human beings say to each other. And so when you rattle off this non-human sounding pitch to someone whose job you've never done, you don't know what they do, they can tell. And so that then provides this feedback mechanism of like, oh, I don't like this. I should not make more of these calls. These calls are painful, right? But imagine you were calling someone to tell them that they just won $10 million in the lottery for real. You would sound way different, right? I often say to, my clients and people, I'm like, can you tell that I love what I do? Can you tell? I'm not fishing for compliments here, right?
Yes, I can tell.
Yeah.
And so I say, great. So, like, I want you to understand, like, how can you tell? What am I doing, right? And people might say, well, you're really enthusiastic and you seem to know a lot about this. No one's fact checking anything I'm saying here, by the way, right? But like, it's a feeling you're getting from me. So I say, like, when you call your customers and prospects during adverse times, during good times, and you're telling them how you can help, do they believe you? Right? Because they can feel your passion, your conviction. The problem is that a lot of us, we take the narrative from marketing, which is sometimes problematic. Number two, and this is like a bigger thing, and this is actually kind of how we bridge this gap. The things that most of us do are normal things that no one cares about. And I say that with all due respect, okay? I train salespeople, right? I'm not curing cancer. I'm not feeding starving children in third world countries or preventing war somewhere. I train salespeople. You put out great content. This company makes payroll software. None of us are splitting the atom here. Okay. So the question is, how do we take, and by the way, some of us are doing fantastic things that are splitting the atom and curing people. And it's fantastic. And that's where people talk about being aligned with the mission. But how do we take a rank and file seller in times like these and arm them with a narrative that they can go out to a prospect or customer and share with passion and conviction in our ability to help them? It seems so simple. It's obviously not so simple, but that enthusiasm, absolutely, as Dean's saying here in the comments, is 100% contagious. The question is, how can we manifest it? So important.
Could you
Well,
could you imagine pitching a friend with the average pitch? Like going
oh
just taking
God.
them for coffee? Somebody, I don't remember where I heard this, but somebody said the best way to practice your pitch is to take your best friend out for a drink or coffee and try to go and pitch them in casual conversation. And I was like, why would you do that? And they're like, if you feel like what you do is not good enough to tell a friend, A, you need to change your job or reframe how you look at your job. And B, all sales is a strategic conversations. You have to have the right person, the right time, the right message, and everything will fall together. But if you can't captivate a friend that trusts you to listen,
Yeah,
that's a
good luck on the
problem.
strangers. Yeah. And actually I think about the sellers that we work with too. This, I think, David, is one of the stumbling blocks that people have when it comes to like DMs on LinkedIn, especially. Like, how can I keep up a casual conversation that isn't just product marketing language with some templated pitch, but like actually having something that's tuned in to the emotional response of somebody else. And that I feel is harder to somewhat in the remote sales era where you're doing stuff entirely asynchronously and most of the time, not by any means 100% of the buying journey, but over text, over just emails and DMs. And do you think that changes like our ability to read people or understand like how they're responding, and how might we manage that too? That would be an interesting angle.
Yeah, 100%. Well, again, you're feeding into another really important. You guys are, I don't, this is not rehearsed, but you're setting this up so nicely. There's this concept I talk a lot about in my book and my content called abstraction, which is just this kind of mental barrier that we put between things. It's the reason why you don't give to starving children in third world countries. It's not that you're a bad person. It's just that that's happening there and I'm here, right? Like abstraction. And this happens a lot in sales, especially as you're sending out texts and messages and emails, and your customers are they're picturing you in their head as the enemy, right? You're not even like a human to them. Like, you don't, it's, anyway, you're like you're the enemy, right? And so one of the most important things that we can do as sellers is humanize ourselves. And one of the studies that was done in this area to kind of prove it out had to do with radiologists, which I talk about in my book, which was, imagine this. So you're a radiologist. So a radiologist is a doctor that just looks at scans all day of like x-rays and MRIs and CAT scans and all that kind of stuff. They don't really spend a lot of time with patients. They just look at their record. And they found now in radiology, there's a thing known as an incidental finding, which is a thing that appeared on your, let's say you broke your arm and you went for an x-ray. Now I'm the radiologist, I'm looking at the x-ray. An incidental finding is something that I found on the x-ray that I wasn't looking for. I wasn't instructed to look for. So I find that you have some arthritis in your elbow, but I was here to look at your broken arm, right? Now, incidental findings are important because sometimes you get an x-ray or whatever. In my situation, they do like an ultrasound, wherever, and they find, oh, cancer. Well, that's not good, right? So that's an incidental finding. What they found was they took these radiologists, they gave them 300 different radiology scans. The radiologist adjudicated on them, and then 3 months later, they snuck them back into their queue but this time they attached photographs of the patients with the scan. What happened? The rate of incidental findings increases 80%. And why? It's the same reason why, people who work in dangerous jobs, like I drive a forklift in a factory, or I'm a long haul trucker driver, and I have pictures of my family on the dashboard. I do that to remind me that it's important to be safe, right? To destroy that layer of abstraction. So I say, in sales, you are the enemy. No one wants to talk to you, as great and wonderful as you are. And so we need to be able to erode that layer of abstraction. And one of the ways we do that is with things like video chat, because now we see each other. It's very hard for me to ignore you and think you're a jerk when we're having this nice conversation. You have a lovely smile, but also when you talk about prospecting on LinkedIn, one of the things I often do, and I just do this as a matter of course, I don't do a ton of LinkedIn prospecting per se, but sometimes if I need to share some information with someone on LinkedIn, I will send them the text-based note, and then I will also use the LinkedIn voicemail feature to leave them a voice message, providing a little bit more context to the note. So at least they hear me. They hear I'm a normal person. I sound authentic when I speak, and it erodes a little bit of that abstraction barrier. Super important.
It's interesting. We talk about like what makes us human and what can be automated right now. And like the voice notes and the videos and all this stuff is hard to fake, which I think passes that genuine, like, is this real test, the sniff test, right? Maybe not the Turing test, but like, is it real? Because I think that's what people are craving right now, being all stuck in their little hidey holes, is they want somebody that has done the work. They want someone to show up, whether, we're talking about priority or importance. Everybody thinks they're at least a little important, right? And so it's like when somebody goes and hits you with a bad pitch and you're like, man, David, didn't you go and like at least like look at my LinkedIn profile first? And then when somebody does, it's just so mind blowing. Like, David, how did you know that? And I feel like leaning in on our humanity with our empathy, with our storytelling, with our ability to go and connect the dots, those unforeseen connections, is what people crave right now. But I think we're getting too far ahead of ourselves, because first comes the conversation, that why change, why now, not the why you. And I think when so many sellers are starting on step 3 and wondering what's going wrong, and I think it just gets so magnified in times like these where people just don't have the patience or the tolerance for it.
Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And in times of adversity, people's, kind of bullshit tolerance goes way down, right? Like I don't have enough money, I don't have enough time. I'm isolating with my family and during the pandemic and like everything's changing all around me. My tolerance for bad behavior is lower, 100%. Yeah. And I actually like to think that there's a process of see, I said process, there you go. A process of natural selection going on where these poor tactics will become less and less tolerated over time. And just by natural selection, the crop of modern sellers that we have are the ones that are more kind, more empathetic. And by the way, I to say, being empathetic does not give you an excuse to be lazy, right? Just because you don't like getting phone calls and you don't like being bothered doesn't mean that I have something important to help. Like, for example, when my wife asks me to do something, do you think I do it the first time she asks me, right? Like sometimes it takes a number of times. I can't tell you how many clients I've kept after with polite persistence, who at the end of the day thanked me for not giving up on them. So being empathetic and really dial into your customers and who you can help does not give you permission to be lazy. It doesn't mean that you can stop after 3 calls, right? You keep going if you believe deep down inside that you can help that person. And if you believe it, there's a much better chance that they will believe it too, just by your tone of voice, your persistence, and they'll thank you at the end of the day, 100%.
Yeah.
I,
Asking
oh,
yourself before you make that call is like, what's worth the interruption? Yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
You've mentally, your mind is ready, so you'll mirror that in your
Hmm.
tone.
I was thinking about something you had brought up a little bit, and this kind of teases into a leadership conversation, which is maybe how we round this out, which is the organization's in survival mode. It's something Nick and I talk a fair bit amount. We haven't recently really, but something that we've observed a lot is that as the car sort of downshifts into first gear, and it's really just the organization is just trying to hit the basics. They are just in first gear. We are only looking for quota attainment, pipeline attainment. We're just trying to keep the ship together and headed in the right direction. How I assume maybe there are some pros to that, but how do you imagine that changes the sales leadership conversation? Like how can sales leaders continue to support their sellers in meaningful human ways, still continuing to hit their objectives, but not let it turn, shall we say, toxic? Maybe is the right word to use in this environment. When the going gets tough and the organization shifts down into first gear and just wants to hit like baseline metrics. Like we just got to close some deals. We're going to ramp, I'm sure we've all heard it before. It's like, wow, we really got to hit this hard. So I didn't know if you had any thoughts on how sales leaders can help. I don't know if protect is the right word, but at the very least, avoid toxic cultures during strange times in companies.
Yeah, 100%. And it's actually timely because today I just published a brand new article. It's called Five Strategies for Leading Sales Teams Through Uncertain Times. And if you go to my blog, which is just cerebralselling.com/blog, it'll be the first one at the top of the list. And one of the things that I say, a lot of times people get frazzled because this is the first time they've experienced any adversity in their careers. Like when you think about it, there was 2008 and now this. Now there's other stuff in between, and there could be momentary periods of adversity for certain industries. I get that. But for a lot of people, especially, and again, I work primarily with high growth technology companies, they're used to seeing up into the right stuff all the time. Like we're joining the rocket ship. This is why. And so they join with that expectation. They don't understand that adversity is actually normal and nothing to be afraid of. Like, and sometimes you just need a certain amount of life experience as well to appreciate that weird shit happens all the time. Right. So not to get frazzled, not lose your cool, not think, oh, I'm going to go jump ship and go somewhere else where like the grass is greener, because we all know that that usually does not turn out the way you think. So I say, like, number one, just assure people that A, this is normal. B, I talk about this concept of creating certainty where you can. And so, I was talking about this with my friend Todd Capone, who's a great dude, and we did a whole session on this together. We were talking about this idea that, brains are prediction machines. The purpose of your brain is to look out for threats. And so it's always saying, okay, if this sequence plays out, if I go down the dark alley, that could not be bad. If I eat this poison thing, that could not be bad. Okay, don't do that. So it's always trying to predict. And when it can't see its way to the finish line, then fear sets in. It's like when you get some kind of weird diagnosis and they're like, oh, Nick, we gotta run some more tests on your whatever, more MRIs, more X-rays, more blood work to see what this thing is. And you're like, doc, what is this? And like, we don't know. That's the worst, right? When you're in this period of uncertainty and waiting for results, because your mind is always thinking, well, what could the worst be? What will what will happen here? What will happen there? And because it's trying to predict, it's trying to prepare you for kind of bad things to happen. And so we don't know everything as leaders. We don't know what's going to happen, but we do know certain things. We know how much money we have left in the bank. We know kind of the stories that we've heard from our customers about the success we've had. And there's a lot of uncertainties that we don't know because the economy is unfolding. But here's what we're going to do. We're going to meet every Friday morning, 9 a.m. And in that meeting, we're going to share the latest about what we know, what we don't know. It's like you saw during the pandemic when you had politicians, Anthony Fauci, doing daily press conferences because there was a lot of unknowns and a lot of fear. And so just sharing on a day-to-day basis, what is it that we know, and create certainty where we can will help. And there's 5 tips in this article, but the last thing I'll just share with you is kind of what we talked about earlier, which is really just realigning your sales motion. So align your sales motion to those customers that you can help the most, right? And even within that, change your messaging, right? So let's say I was selling The example I give is like PPE to a hospital. I had to do that before the pandemic, and I have to do it in the pandemic. But all of a sudden, the thing that my customer cares about as it relates to PPE, whereas before it would be cost, quality needs to be okay, delivery, I can get here this week, next week doesn't make a difference. Now it's like there's no more toilet paper. I don't care how much it costs. I need it here yesterday. So I'm still selling to the same customer, but the thing that they value all of a sudden changes. The feelings that they're buying when they buy us have changed. So I say, as a leader, one of the things that we can do is lead the charge with our teams of kind of realigning our emotional connection to our customers, really dialing in like what is it that they value today and aligning our sales motion thusly. So those are just a few tips for leaders.
Juicy. That's so good.
It was great. One thing that keeps on like coming back up, how do you, we sort of circled around this, and obviously your book is titled along the same dimension here, of selling the way you buy. How are you creating those feedback loops, or understanding what your buyers actually want? And I mean, not necessarily just in like times like these where there are macro shifts and some of it is visible if you pay attention, but even in like the broader shift, let's say from 2015 probably, where now buyers are doing more research on their own. They aren't only looking to sellers for information. There's more people on the buying committee. People are more risk averse, or organizations at least are more risk averse than they used to be. How do you go about finding that insight and gathering that information together? Like, is it a formal process, or are you just always just listening in and connecting the dots as you talk with more stakeholders in a sale?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Like, there's kind of two parts to this. The first part is asking them, what do you care about in your discovery motion? That's easy enough. But in a way, like everyone's going to ask them that. What keeps you up at night? Like everyone's going to ask that question. The second part is to actually be really mindful of the trends and patterns that you see by virtue of the fact that you are working. Like think about this: if you're selling to a VP of sales, that VP of sales works in oftentimes in isolation in their own universe, maybe with their colleagues and so on. If you're selling to VPs of sales, you spend all day, every day, just talking to people like them. And there are problems that they're experiencing that you can bring them that aren't even necessarily top of mind. So that's when we talk about cutting. Okay, maybe we'll end at how we began. We talk about cutting. Sometimes I refer to this as the unknown unspoken. This, for example, the problem of experience asymmetry that I talked about how younger salespeople struggle to connect with that fear and trepidation. Whenever I talk to one of my clients about it that has, younger salespeople or new salespeople or they're fast growth, and I say, do you have this? Do you ever listen to their calls? Do you ever hear the fear and trepidation? They're like, yes, that thing that you said, we have that, right? But I will tell you, in all my years of doing this, no customer has ever brought that problem to me. That's a problem, even though they have it. If I ask them what their problems are, they wouldn't tell me. And not because they're trying to hold out on me, just because they don't know. It's not top of mind. It's my job as the seller to triangulate the signals of what I'm seeing and hearing with clients like them and distill it down in a way that, and I call this synthesis, but like you're synthesizing it down in a way that they look at and say, it was presented so simply and elegantly and truthfully and honestly with high conviction. They're like, yes, it's a problem that you're bringing me. And the beauty is when you're a seller and you bring the customer problems, you become the de facto person to solve those problems because you put the form to it, right? And number two, it differentiates you as the seller. So the easy thing is to ask. The harder thing is to kind of spot those trends and patterns and bring those problems to your customer.
Wow, that is a great way to go and wrap up the show.
I know, no kidding. David, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. It's been awesome. I know we've covered a lot of ground. Thank you for coming on this edition of the B2B Power Hour. I know people can find you out here on LinkedIn. You're active. And also you dropped the link earlier, cerebralselling.com. There's lots of great resources there. And 10 out of 10, I can only recommend his book as well. Having been an avid reader, it's lovely. So check out Sell the Way You Buy. Right? Is that the full title, David? Okay, just making
Yeah.
sure.
There's a subtitle that's no one cares about. But yes, the
Oh,
big
okay,
one is
okay.
no. It's called Sell the Way You Buy. It's called Sell the Way You Buy, a modern approach to sales that actually works, in brackets, even on you. But
Got it.
I never
Okay.
really say that rest of that part anyways when I talk about it.
That's why I asked. Well, thank you again so much for joining. And thanks to everybody who joined us today. It was great to see everyone. Thanks.
Thank you so
Thanks everyone.
much.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Take care, everyone.